Today we're going to talk about trusts for children, how they're structured, and why you might choose one structure over another. My name's Gregory Singleton. I'm an estate planning and probate attorney in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I work for Signature Law, which serves the Twin Cities and Greater Minnesota alike. Just as a reminder, today we're talking about Minnesota law, though a lot of the concepts that we discuss will be transferable to other jurisdictions as well. Just talk with a lawyer in your current jurisdiction. And if you do like today's video, please feel free to smash that like and subscribe button below. It really helps support the channel. So, trusts for children. What are we talking about? Essentially, we're talking about the difference between a pot trust, or also called a joint trust, versus separate trusts or individualized trusts for the children. An underlying concept is that in Minnesota, children are not allowed to inherit until they reach the age of 21. At that point, you can distribute whatever you want in trust. So up until that point, everything has to be in a trust. And then when they hit 21, then they can have whatever's left. One thing to note is that you don't have to choose 21 as the distribution age. Today, we're going to talk about doing a distribution age of 25. I like 25 because it allows a kid to get through college, and they're a little bit older and more responsible and able to manage the funds. So for simplicity's sake, we're talking about age 25 and 3 children, one age 5, 10, and 15 years old, creatively named A, B, and C. So let's talk about a separate trusts and how they're structured. Well, very simply, each child gets their own trust. And what they get the trust, and the money in the trust has to last them until they reach the distribution age. For the 5-year-old, it's going to be 20 years. For the 15 or 10-year-old, it'll be 15 years. And for the 15-year-old, it will be 10 years. So you can have different amounts in each trust or the same amount in each trust. And at the age of distribution, it's all distributed out. So there's 2 ways you can handle this. You can either put in the same amount, 100,000, into each trust, or very simply, you could say, I'm going to give the children $20,000 a year to live off of, or pick a number, and they have to, when they hit the age of majority, then they'll have a payout. So you could, for instance, give them $20,000 a year. So the 5-year-old would get $400,000. The 10-year-old would get $300,000. I hope I'm doing this math right. And the 15-year-old will get $200,000. And then what you can have is, say you've got extra money after spending $900,000. Let's say you have an estate that's worth $2 million. You could give them each another $333,000. And that is what they're doing for their separate trusts. Joint trusts, or a pot trust, is slightly different. Let me just erase some of this real quick. Instead of having separate trusts for each child, you're going to have one trust for all the children. And this will include all your assets. So it's distributed not when each child reaches 25, but rather when the youngest child reaches the age of 25, or the distribution age, whatever you choose it to be. So it'll be 20 years until the 5-year-old is reached the age of 25, but for the 10-year-old, they're actually not going to get a distribution until they reach the age of 30. And the 15-year-old is not going to be able to reach a distribution until they reach the age of 35. So this is a little bit different situation. You can give, let's say you've got $900,000. You can expect each child to use $300,000 during this period, and at the end, whatever is left, the balance, it doesn't matter how much each child took out of the trust, the balance is distributed evenly among the 3 children. One thing to note is that if one child has let's say a substantial medical problem, and they have to draw a large amount of money out to pay for medical bills, say $100,000, that comes out of the whole pot. And then at the end, even though they took out an extra $100,000, they still get an even amount at the age of distribution. So let's talk about pot trusts and separate trusts separately, and some of the pros and cons and things to consider for each. First of all, pot trusts are generally easier to administer. You got one trustee, You don't have to divide out receipts. It's just one lump of money, and anything that the kids use comes out of a trust. If you have limited resources, it might be more beneficial to do a pot trust. If you have separate trusts, at a certain point, the trust becomes uneconomical to support, and you want to pay out the trust anyways. So if you have limited resources, you might want to just put it into a pot and let that be distributed out for the kids. If you have a child with special needs, such as a disability where they're going to incur a large number of accommodation and medical costs, it may make sense to do a pot trust if those costs are going to be unknown, which they generally are. That allows them to get what they need to reach the age of distribution. That's the goal, is to raise them, and then anything else they get beyond that is just gravy. One thing to note for pot trusts, it is better if the children are closer in age. As you can see, when there's a 10-year difference, we have a child that's receiving a distribution at age 25 and one that's at age 35. The 35-year-old was not able to use that lump sum to go to college unless they go to college late. They might already have a house and might not be able, or they might have wanted to put a down payment on a house years ago, but they wouldn't have been able to afford it because they didn't have the distribution from the pot trust. So closer in age is a little bit easier to administer and manage for having a pot trust. For separate trusts, generally you want to have more resources. It makes it easier to split up the money and make sure that each kid can reach the age of majority. To note, not all the kids don't have to receive 1/3 of the estate. It doesn't have to be equal. You could, for separate trusts, you could give one child, let's say $100,000, or let's say $200,000. Let's say this child B has a special needs, and they're going to need a lot more medical bills and everything else. So you could give them $500,000, and this kid could only get $50,000 because they got a shorter distance to go. You do have to plan ahead, and you try to think that you know what's going to happen. And there's a lot of unknowns when we're talking about kids with disabilities and special needs. So splitting it up appropriately with separate trusts might be a little bit difficult. One thing to keep in mind is that having separate trusts are harder to administer. More trusts equal more trustees, or one trustee who handles multiple trusts. And you have to do a lot more splitting up receipts and everything, so it can be a little bit more complicated. There is a bonus to having separate trusts that you don't really get with joint trusts. You can structure things in a way to replicate this somewhat. In separate trusts, when they hit the age of majority, you can structure it that they will maintain the trust after they've reached the age of distribution. So the kid can become their own trustee, continue to receive an income off the trust, not be able to access the principal, and therefore create some creditor protections in case they have some problems with creditors. The creditors will not be able to access the funds because they're an irrevocable trust, and therefore the kid can get a guaranteed income for a longer period of time. Beyond pot trusts and separate trusts, you can do what's called a hybrid trust, and in this case you would have both a pot and a separate trust by having one of each. So take the situation where you give $20,000 to each child for the age to get to them to the age of distribution. So you give child A is going to get $400,000, child B is going to get $300,000, child C is going to get $200,000. Then what you can do is you can create a joint trust or a pot trust and fund it with a certain amount of money, let's say $500,000. Now, to access this money, this is for cases when there's a major medical problem, or let's say you could use it for education. If a child wants to go to college or graduate school, they can access the money in this trust. You still have an age of distribution where the youngest, once they reach that age, will get all the proceeds from the pot trust will be distributed among the 3 children. It doesn't have to be the same age as this. It could be higher, let's say 35-year-old before the pot trust is distributed. It's one possibility. I will say that this can get overly complicated. it can be done. That doesn't mean you want to do it. It's going to be more difficult to administer because you're adding a whole nother trust with a whole nother set of terms on it. You may want to have multiple trustees. If you have a different trustee for each trust, then it's going to be more complicated. If you have a corporate trustee that's handling all, in this case, 4 trusts, it's going to cost more to administer. There is something to be said about the KISS standard, which stands for, of course, keep it simple, stupid. Maybe just do a pot trust or just do separate trusts. So some considerations for deciding which structure to use. Look at the needs of the children. If you do have a child with special needs and you have limited resources, it may make sense to do a pot trust. Look at the ages of the children. If they are close in age, separate trust is a lot more viable. A pot trust gets a lot more difficult to, or I guess unwieldy, if there's a big difference in age between the children. Remember, you don't have to choose 21 as the age of distribution. A lot of people choose age 25 or 26 or even 30 or older, just because that's the age at which the kids are able to manage the assets a little bit better. And do some planning for the future. You may have only one child now, and in that case, it doesn't matter whether you set up as pot or special need or as pot or separate trusts. But if you have more children in the future, you're going to want to cover that contingency in your estate plan. So there you go. That's my take on joint versus separate trusts. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please feel free to smash that like and subscribe button below. It does help support the channel. And if you subscribe, you'll get a new video every other Wednesday. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, until next time, this is Gregory Singleton with Signature Law.